The Galactic Council had warned everyone, and their warning had been ignored. The message had been clear. Do not involve humans in this war. Their unpredictable nature will lead to chaos that cannot be controlled. It was an urgent plea, backed by centuries of observation. But when the Drexler Dominion found themselves at a standstill in their war against the Vrosk Confederacy, they decided to take a risk. The Dominion, desperate for any advantage, made the call to recruit human mercenaries, believing their unpredictability could turn the tide in their favor. The Galactic Council had long known that humanity's approach to warfare was unlike any other species. For all their military prowess, humans were as much a force of chaos as they were a force of order. Their tactics were unconventional, their motivations unpredictable, and their loyalty mercenary at best. The Council had kept humanity in check for decades, advising all factions to avoid recruiting them, no matter how tempting it seemed. After all, humans didn't play by anyone's rules, they made their own. The Drexler, however, ignored all advice. They were running out of options, and they needed a way to break the deadlock in their conflict with the Vrosk. The humans had a reputation for being effective, even if they didn't always play fair. But the Drexler didn't care about fairness. They cared about winning. The first contact was sent with caution. A message was delivered to Captain Jake Adams, leader of the most notorious human mercenary group in the sector. The offer was tempting, too tempting to resist, an astronomical sum in exchange for a simple agreement to help the Drexler defeat the Vrosk. Adams had seen his fair share of galactic wars, and his team had fought in dozens of battles, mostly for profit. He wasn't a soldier for any cause, not for the Drexler or anyone else. He fought for one thing: money. If the Drexler were willing to pay for his services, then he and his crew would gladly oblige, at least until they had their fill. As always, humanity's first rule of war was simple: neutrality. When offered a job, they took it. But they didn't choose sides. They worked for whoever had the deepest pockets. This approach wasn't out of cowardice or lack of principles, it was just the human way. The Drexler thought they were getting a group of loyal soldiers, willing to fight in the trenches for their cause. What they didn't realize was that they were dealing with a group of mercenaries who had no intention of taking sides. From the moment Captain Adams and his team arrived, things began to change. The Drexler had expected their new mercenaries to play the role of typical soldiers, professional, disciplined, loyal to the highest bidder. Instead, they got a crew of unpredictable, hard-hitting, and audacious individuals who didn't care about allegiances, protocols, or honor. They cared about one thing: creating chaos. And chaos was exactly what they brought. The humans weren't interested in the Drexler's grand strategy. They had their own way of doing things, a style that baffled both the Drexler and the Vrosk. First, Captain Adams had the human crew assess the battlefield, not from the perspective of military might, but from the perspective of opportunity. Every faction had weaknesses, every situation had leverage. They didn't need to take sides. They could just sabotage the system. The first mission was a simple reconnaissance, or so the Drexler thought. They sent the humans in to gather intelligence on a Vrosk supply base. Instead of taking the base outright, Adams and his team decided to have a bit of fun. They planted false information, spreading rumors and faking signs of sabotage. They made it look like the Vrosk had attacked their own supply line, sparking confusion and infighting within the Vrosk ranks. Meanwhile, the Drexler were left to ponder their own military strategy, unable to figure out where the real threat had come from. The humans didn't even fire a shot, but they had caused more damage to the Vrosk's morale than any conventional weapon could have done. This was the human way. When it came to war, they weren't interested in following the rules, they made the rules. The Drexler were impressed, though they didn't fully understand what was happening. They assumed it was just luck. But for the humans, it wasn't luck, it was expertise. In the grand game of intergalactic warfare, human mercenaries had mastered the art of creating confusion. They didn't care about direct confrontation. Instead, they sowed the seeds of distrust, misinformation, and disorder. Captain Adams knew that the Drexler, in their desperation, would demand more. And the more they demanded, the more the humans would give, at least, in the form of chaos. Every mission became an opportunity for subversion. Every battle became a chance to manipulate the enemy's perception of the war. The Drexler began to notice that their carefully laid plans were falling apart. Allies became enemies, enemies became allies, and everything seemed to be in a state of perpetual confusion. But even the Drexler didn't realize the full extent of the mess they were creating. When the humans attacked a Vrosk supply convoy, they didn't destroy it. Instead, they kidnapped the Vrosk high-ranking officer leading it. Then, in a shocking display of audacity, they sent the officer back with a message. "Next time, we won't be so friendly." The message was simple. Humans weren't just mercenaries. They were a force unto themselves, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and unwilling to play by anyone's rules. With every mission, Captain Adams and his crew deepened their involvement. The Drexler were starting to believe that the humans could turn the tide in their favor, but the humans weren't interested in victory for the Drexler. They were interested in creating a spectacle. The war between the Drexler and the Vrosk was no longer about victory, it was about chaos, and the humans were playing the role of the wild card in a game no one could control. The human crew was living up to their reputation. As the Drexler sent more resources and more soldiers to fight alongside the humans, they quickly found that the humans weren't just complicating the battlefield, they were rewriting the rules of the war. Every victory felt hollow. Every defeat was only temporary. The humans, it seemed, were completely impervious to being manipulated. And worse, they didn't care who won the war as long as they got paid. The Drexler Dominion had hoped to use humanity to gain an advantage, but instead, they found themselves in a war they could no longer control. The Council had been right all along. You could never predict what humans would do in a war. And as the humans continued to wreak havoc, the galaxy was beginning to learn a very important lesson. **** Never underestimate the chaos humanity could bring. ****. As the humans prepared for their next mission, Captain Adams sat back and smiled. The war was spiraling out of control, and the only thing they knew for sure was that they'd walk away with their pockets full. And that was just how humans liked it. Captain Jake Adams and his crew had always known that their neutral approach to warfare was a double-edged sword. It wasn't about choosing sides or fighting for a cause. It was about taking advantage of every opportunity, exploiting weaknesses, and never letting an opportunity for profit slip through their fingers. But now, having entered the war between the Drexler Dominion and the Vrosk Confederacy, the humans realized that their approach was far more chaotic than anyone anticipated. The Drexler were already starting to see the cracks in their plans, but the full scope of human unpredictability was about to hit them hard. The humans' first task had been simple enough: provide logistical support and sabotage the Vrosk supply lines. The Drexler assumed this would be an easy job. After all, they were paying for the best mercenaries in the galaxy. They expected military precision, careful strategy, and a degree of professionalism that matched their own. What they got instead was a group of humans who viewed war as one big opportunity for chaos. Captain Adams didn't care about tactics in the traditional sense. Why go through the hassle of a direct assault when you could cause the same amount of destruction by simply spreading misinformation? The humans began by using their communication channels to send misleading data to both sides, feeding them false information about supply routes, troop movements, and even false intelligence about key military targets. The Drexler thought they were getting an edge when, in reality, they were unknowingly sabotaging their own efforts. The beauty of human strategy, as Captain Adams saw it, was that it didn't have to make sense to anyone but the humans themselves. For them, warfare was a game of chess, but the rules were made up on the fly. No one, either the Drexler nor the Vrosk, could predict what would happen next. One moment, they were confident they had the upper hand. The next, they were stumbling in the dark, unable to tell who their enemies truly were. Adams' crew took to the field with the same casual confidence they always did. No uniforms. No allegiances. They didn't need them. Instead of fighting for one side or the other, they waged their war on the fringes. Sabotaging weapons caches, planting explosive devices in critical infrastructure, and causing as much confusion as possible were their daily tasks. They'd never directly engage in a full-scale battle. Why would they? They didn't need to fight to win. All they needed was to make things as complicated as possible for the Drexler and Vrosk, and that was a job they excelled at. One of the first major operations was the diversion of a Vrosk military convoy. Instead of ambushing it, as the Drexler would have expected, the humans turned the convoy into a decoy. They altered the coordinates and made it appear as though the convoy was heading toward an entirely different part of the battlefield. When the Drexler arrived to intercept it, they found nothing. Meanwhile, the Vrosk had rerouted their own forces, wasting valuable time and resources chasing an imaginary target. The Drexler generals, confused and frustrated, demanded an explanation. But Adams and his crew remained silent. They had no obligation to explain their methods to anyone. They weren't soldiers, they were mercenaries. Their only concern was keeping their bank accounts full. Every success they had, every battle they didn't fight, was another paycheck. The Drexler could gripe and complain all they wanted, but as long as the humans were on their payroll, they weren't going to get any answers. But it wasn't just the Drexler who were affected by this chaos. The Vrosk, too, were struggling to understand the sudden shift in the tides of war. The humans' meddling was beginning to take a toll on their morale as well. At first, the Vrosk had dismissed the mercenaries as a minor nuisance. But soon, they realized that the humans were not just playing games, they were reshaping the entire battlefield. Their tactics were unlike anything the Vrosk had ever encountered, and it was clear that the humans had no intention of choosing a side. The humans weren't trying to win the war, they were trying to break the war itself. By turning the two factions against each other, by spreading lies and false intelligence, the humans were setting both sides up for failure. They weren't killing soldiers or blowing up ships. They were making both factions distrust each other. They were taking advantage of the paranoia that comes with war, and using it to their advantage. Captain Adams' crew continued their work with no regard for the conventional rules of engagement. One of their next tasks was to create a rift between the Drexler and their supposed allies. The humans fed false rumors to the Drexler, suggesting that their allies were planning to betray them. At the same time, they sent similar rumors to the Vrosk, causing them to mistrust their own alliances. The result? A war where both sides were constantly second-guessing their every move. And while both sides were busy dealing with their internal strife, the humans were laughing all the way to the bank. But their tactics weren't just about causing confusion. They had another trick up their sleeves: exploitation of opportunity. Whenever an opening presented itself, they took it. If a Vrosk supply line was vulnerable, they didn't destroy it. They commandeered it. They didn't take prisoners, they took everything. Weapons, equipment, intelligence, anything that could be useful. And they did it with such efficiency and precision that both sides began to wonder if they were up against an army of spies rather than mercenaries. One of the most effective strategies was human infiltration. Instead of launching direct attacks, they sent small, covert teams to infiltrate critical positions. They planted false data, destroyed key communications equipment, and in some cases, even assassinated high-ranking officers from both sides, never leaving a trace. In this game, there were no rules. There was no honor. There was only chaos, and chaos, as the humans knew, was an opportunity waiting to be exploited. But perhaps the greatest display of their unpredictability came when Captain Adams and his crew decided to fake their own deaths. The Drexler thought they had wiped out a human outpost, only to learn later that the humans had faked their deaths and were, in fact, lying in wait for their next move. The Vrosk, meanwhile, were still reeling from the surprise attack, not knowing whether they were dealing with a new threat or just more human tricks. The confusion was so profound that both sides began questioning their intelligence, making their next steps even more uncertain. As the humans continued to operate in the background, pulling strings and causing chaos, the Drexler began to understand that their mercenaries were no ordinary soldiers. But by the time they realized it, it was too late. They had already been caught in the web of human disruption, and there was no escaping the chaos they had unleashed. Captain Adams had made it clear from the start: the humans weren't there to fight for anyone, they were there to profit from everyone. Both the Drexler and the Vrosk were playing by rules they had created, while the humans had no rules at all. It wasn't about winning, It was about watching both sides stumble over themselves, fighting a war that was already lost to them. With every mission, the humans drew closer to their goal, not to end the war, but to ensure that both factions were too distracted to notice that the humans were the ones pulling the strings. They weren't soldiers. They were chaos agents, and the galaxy was about to learn just how dangerous that could be. As the human mercenaries continued their disruptive strategy, both the Drexer Dominion and the Vrosk Confederacy found themselves tangled in a web of misinformation, sabotage, and confusion. What had started as a simple contract to disrupt enemy operations had spiraled into something far more chaotic, and neither faction could figure out how to put the pieces back together. The humans, ever unpredictable, were no longer just observers in this war, they were the prime movers of chaos itself. Captain Jake Adams, ever the opportunist, had no intention of picking a side in the conflict. His loyalty was to one thing only: profit. But as the war continued to unfold, it became clear that this wasn't just about money anymore. The humans had inadvertently stumbled onto a much bigger issue, one that could threaten the entire galaxy. Deep within the heart of the Drexer's war plans, they uncovered a secret that could change everything. The Drexer were in possession of a doomsday weapon. The weapon, codenamed Eclipse, was a massive interstellar device capable of wiping out entire planets. It was the final card in the Drexer's hand, a weapon so powerful that it could end the war in an instant. The problem, however, was that the Drexer weren't entirely sure how to control it. The weapon was in the final stages of development, and a few key components still needed to be activated. But once those components were linked, it would be ready to destroy entire star systems. And that was the last thing the humans expected to find when they started poking around the Drexer's military assets. At first, Adams didn't care. He wasn't here to play hero. He wasn't here to save anyone. But then, after more sabotage and covert missions, the implications of the weapon started to sink in. The Drexer, in their desperation to win, had been willing to cross any line, and the Vrosk, in their own blind zeal, would likely do the same. The result could be catastrophic. No amount of money could justify the kind of destruction that Eclipse would bring. Still, Adams' mercenary code was clear: the job wasn't over until he got paid. So, while he wasn't exactly in a hurry to stop the weapon, he did start to think about the long-term consequences. His crew had survived wars before, and they could survive this one too, if they stayed out of the way. But the more they uncovered about Eclipse, the more dangerous the situation became. Captain Adams wasn't about to sit back and watch the galaxy burn, even if it meant getting involved in a fight he wasn't interested in. In true human fashion, he realized there was one thing worse than getting caught in a war, and that was losing control of it entirely. The Drexer could use Eclipse to decimate the Vrosk, but who's to say they wouldn't use it again? Or worse, the Vrosk might get their hands on it. Humanity had to make sure the weapon never saw the light of day, because whoever controlled it would control the fate of the galaxy. The decision wasn't easy. The humans had never been in the business of saving planets, far from it. They were mercenaries, after all. The Drexer were paying them, and so were the Vrosk. Both factions had their own agendas, but the humans had never cared about any of them. Yet, as Adams pondered the situation, something gnawed at him. The war was spiraling out of control, and the humans were at the epicenter of it all. If they did nothing, they could make a lot of money. If they intervened, they might just save the galaxy from something far worse than either of the warring factions had planned. Adams wasn't the type to jump into moral debates, but the stakes had changed. With Eclipse potentially in play, the balance of power in the galaxy would shift irrevocably. As much as the humans liked their chaos, they also understood that sometimes, too much chaos could make everyone lose control, including them. If Eclipse was activated, the result would be more than just a war. It would be extinction. To make matters more complicated, Adams discovered that one of his crew members, Lura, had a personal stake in the conflict. Lura, an alien assassin who had been working with the humans as an ally, had ties to the Vrosk. It wasn't something she talked about often, but her loyalties were starting to surface. It turned out that Lura had been a former soldier in the Vrosk Confederacy, before her path had diverged into the shadows of assassination and mercenary work. Her history with the Vrosk, combined with her close connection to the humans, put her in an awkward position. The last thing Lura wanted was to see the Drexler or the Vrosk win. But she knew the stakes. The Vrosk would likely try to use Eclipse for their own ends if they got the chance. The question was whether she would help the humans stop the weapon, or allow the galaxy to burn while she watched from the sidelines. Lura wasn't the only one questioning the humans' role in all this. As the humans' methods continued to complicate the war, even the Drexler began to get frustrated. They couldn't understand why the humans refused to pick a side. To them, it was simple: the Drexler were fighting to win. Why wouldn't the humans just help them achieve victory? But Adams didn't work for ideals. He worked for cash. And the Drexler were starting to realize that their reliance on the humans for victory had backfired. Every move they made, every battle they won, was just another layer in the chaos that the humans had orchestrated. But the real twist came when Adams discovered the true nature of the weapon. The Drexler hadn't just built a doomsday device, they had created a self-replicating war machine. Once activated, Eclipse could make its own versions, multiplying rapidly and spreading across the galaxy. The weapon wasn't just a tool of destruction, it was a virus, capable of sweeping through entire systems without warning. If it went unchecked, no one would be safe, and no one would be able to stop it. The Drexler had built something that, once released, would become unstoppable. Now, the stakes had gone beyond money. Adams didn't care about the Drexler or the Vrosk, but he wasn't about to let them destroy everything in the process. He knew what the consequences of Eclipse could mean for the galaxy, and more importantly, for the humans themselves. If the war escalated to the point of using the weapon, it would mean the end of all neutral zones, the end of free mercenaries, and the end of their ability to make a living in a galaxy that was rapidly descending into chaos. Captain Adams and his crew, despite their love of chaos, found themselves at a crossroads. They could continue playing both sides, continue profiting from the conflict. But in the end, they knew that the galaxy, their galaxy would not survive Eclipse. The question was no longer about money. It was about survival. And if that meant going against the Drexler and the Vrosk, so be it. The humans had always thrived on chaos, but even they understood when it was time to control it. And in this case, the only way to keep the galaxy intact was to stop Eclipse before it could ever be activated. The decision to take action had been a long time coming. Captain Jake Adams had always preferred the status quo: profit, chaos, and minimal involvement in the wider consequences of galactic conflicts. But now, staring down the weapon that could decimate entire systems, the humans knew they had reached a tipping point. Eclipse was no longer just a secret weapon hidden in a distant lab. It was a ticking time bomb that threatened to unravel the galaxy. The stakes had never been higher, and the humans were about to take matters into their own hands. Adams gathered his crew and laid out the plan. It wasn't the cleanest, most straightforward operation, they never did things that way, but it was the only option that made sense. They would infiltrate the Drexler's secret facility where Eclipse was being held, sabotage the weapon, and ensure it could never be activated. Simple enough in theory, though the reality would be far messier. The Drexler were formidable opponents, and they wouldn't give up their weapon without a fight. But as Adams liked to say, the more complicated the job, the more rewarding it would be. There was money in chaos, and there was chaos to be had. The humans had always relied on their unpredictable tactics, and this operation would be no different. They didn't have the luxury of brute force, nor would they ever play by conventional rules. They had no allegiance to the Drexler, no loyalty to the Vrosk. Hell, they didn't even like each other half the time. But there was one thing they could all agree on: Eclipse couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. Adams and his team knew that time was running out. The Drexler were preparing to test the weapon in the next few days, and if they succeeded, the weapon's full power would be unleashed. The humans didn't have the luxury of waiting for the Drexler to make their first move. They needed to act fast, or the galaxy would fall into chaos before they could stop it. Lura, the alien assassin with a past in the Vrosk Confederacy, was the perfect infiltrator for the mission. She had connections, knowledge, and an ability to move in and out of enemy territory without leaving a trace. Her skills would be invaluable in breaching the Drexer's heavily guarded facility. But Laura had another reason for wanting to see Eclipse destroyed. She wasn't just a mercenary anymore. She had ties to the Vrosk, but her alliance was first and foremost with her human comrades. She wasn't about to let her old life get in the way of doing the right thing. The mission had 3 phases: infiltration, sabotage, and extraction. Infiltration was the hardest part. Getting into the Drexer's stronghold would be no small feat. The Drexer had cut off all communication from the outside world, and their facility was protected by an army of elite soldiers, automated defense systems, and surveillance technologies. But the humans were not deterred. They had one major advantage: the Drexer had underestimated them. Their plan involved using the chaos they had already sowed throughout the war to slip through unnoticed. While Laura handled the infiltration, Captain Adams and the rest of the crew would act as the distractions. They planned a series of coordinated attacks on key Drexer military positions around the facility. This wouldn't be a direct assault on the weapon itself. Instead, it would force the Drexer to shift their resources, thin their ranks, and draw attention away from their most valuable asset. The humans' knack for misdirection and confusion would play to their advantage once again. The sabotage phase was equally critical. Once Laura breached the facility, she would need to disable the security systems and plant the necessary charges to disable Eclipse. The weapon was far more complex than any human had encountered, but Laura's past experience with the Vrosk military's experimental tech gave her an edge. She was intimately familiar with high-tech weaponry, and this one was no different, though its scale was unprecedented. It had been designed to be unstoppable, and it would take every ounce of her skill to ensure it could never be activated. As Laura worked to disable the weapon, Captain Adams had the unenviable task of keeping the Drexer distracted long enough to give her time. He would lead his crew in a series of raids on Drexer supply depots, cutting off their reinforcements and striking at critical infrastructure. The humans knew how to make noise. They had learned the art of being in the right place at the right time, always ensuring that their actions were loud enough to keep everyone looking in the wrong direction. But there was a problem: the Vrosk. They had caught wind of the humans' intentions, and they were determined to make sure they didn't succeed. Despite their mistrust of the Drexer, the Vrosk knew the true value of Eclipse. If the weapon were destroyed, it would swing the balance of power in favor of the Drexer, something the Vrosk couldn't afford to let happen. A third faction was now in play, and it threatened to derail everything the humans had worked for. The humans weren't fighting for the Drexer, and they weren't fighting for the Vrosk. They were fighting for the galaxy's survival. But in the chaos of war, survival was a fluid thing. No one was going to play by the same rules. As Adams and his team fought to keep the Drexer's attention focused on them, the Vrosk made their move. They sent a strike force to neutralize the human mercenaries before they could reach the facility. What the Vrosk didn't realize was that the humans had already anticipated this. Their diversion tactics had kept the Vrosk guessing, and their own forces were spread thin. As the Vrosk launched their attack, they found themselves caught in a vicious trap. The humans had anticipated their every move, and the strike force was cut down before they could reach the facility. With the Vrosk dealt with, the humans turned their full attention to Eclipse. Laura had made significant progress in disabling the weapon, but time was running out. The Drexer were regrouping, and their forces were closing in. The sabotage was taking longer than expected, and the clock was ticking. But as Laura finally activated the final sequence, disabling the weapon's power source, a loud rumble echoed through the facility. The Drexer had realized what was happening. Adams and his crew fought their way into the heart of the facility, just as Laura completed the final steps. Eclipse was now inactive, its power drained and its systems rendered useless. But the Drexer were not going down without a fight. A massive firefight erupted as the humans, now joined by Laura, made their escape, carrying with them critical intel and the knowledge that they had just saved countless star systems from annihilation. As they made their way back to their ship, Captain Adams looked out at the stars. The war wasn't over. The Drexer and the Vrosk would continue to clash, and the galaxy would remain a battleground. But the humans had won this round. Eclipse was gone, and they had made sure of it. There was still money to be made, still chaos to spread, and still wars to be fought. But for now, they had done something no one expected, something even they hadn't thought they would do. They had saved the galaxy.